Oh yeah, back in the lead.
My name's Brandon and this is Cartoon Network Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Cartoon Network franchises and retrospectively review them. This week we're jumping into the virtual world of Code Lyoko to review Code Lyoko Get Ready to Virtualize on the Nintendo DS. Code Lyoko was a French animated show that combined 2D and 3D animation and rose to popularity through its airings on Cartoon Network. Personally, I remember watching this show a lot when it was featured on Toasted TV here in Australia. Toasted TV was a kids animated programming block that aired from 7 to 9 AM Monday through Friday. Basically, if your show got a run on this or its predecessor Cheese TV, it was pretty much guaranteed your show would gain popularity. Code Lyoko aired from 2004 to 2007, and by its final year it was so popular that 3 games were either releasing or in development based on the series. Get Ready to Virtualize was released on May 15, 2007, and was developed by our old friends DC Studios. If that name sounds familiar, it's because they developed the extremely disappointing Cartoon Network Speedway on the Game Boy Advance. While it was technically a competently made game, it was an extremely bare-bones Cartoon Network crossover kart racer. This game would also prove to be their penultimate game, as they would close their doors for good on September 25, 2007 after releasing the DS port of Thrillville Off the Rails. The DS version of that game was the only version to score under 70 on Metacritic. This doesn't fill me with hope. However, Get Ready to Virtualize performed quite well with critics at the time. Well, at least by Cartoon Network standards. It sits at a healthy 62 on Metacritic, making it tied for the 8th highest rated Cartoon Network game and the highest rated Code Lyoko game. It grabbed a 6 out of 10 from GameSpot, 6.5 out of 10 from IGN, and 7 out of 10 from Nintendo Power. Those are 3 solid scores from 3 reputable publications. Trying to judge what this game is like based on all this info just ends up with mixed messages, so I'm going to have to jump in and experience it for myself. When you first boot up Code Lyoko Get Ready to Virtualize, you're treated to a nice version of the show's opening. This is the sort of thing other Cartoon Network handheld games had tried to do previously, but it was usually poor in execution. The increased power of the DS is on display here. In fact, not only do we get the show's opening, but we also get so many cutscenes that are ripped straight from the show with very little downgrade in quality. And I'm not talking about 5-second snippets from the show either. There are so many lengthy cutscenes littered throughout the game. This is the first time I've felt like the DS's increased power has been put to good use for a Cartoon Network game. Once you actually jump into the game, you'll see that it's divided up into chapters. You'll play through 15 of these, and each one is essentially adapting an episode of the show. While I could imagine this would be an enjoyable piece of fan service for pre-existing fans, this makes the game completely nonsensical if you aren't already familiar with it. It's like getting the Cliff Notes version of the show, but if somebody spilled ink all over the Cliff Notes and you're only getting specific sections. It also doesn't help that there is zero conclusion to any of the chapters. They all just end abruptly. Each chapter is divided into 2 sections, much like the show. You'll spend a portion of it in the real world and a portion of it in Lyoko. If you've seen the show, you know that Code Lyoko does a unique thing where the real world is 2D animation and Lyoko is 3D. DC Studios have tried their best to emulate that here. The 2D sections are basically a point-and-click adventure game, while Lyoko turns it into a 3D action game. This is an interesting concept in theory. In reality, the execution misses the mark completely. In the 2D sections, you'll be tasked with walking around the gang's school and doing various errands and busy work. Movement is controlled via either the touchscreen or the D-pad, although I'd recommend the touchscreen as the D-pad seemed like the most sluggish way to move around. On the top screen you have a map, which is something sorely needed in this game. However, DC Studios have somehow managed to bungle this up. Usually walking up in a game like this would correspond with travelling north on the map, but here that's not the case. The directions are all out of whack, essentially rendering the map useless. This makes traversing the rather expansive world an absolute chore at first. You basically need to memorise the entire layout of the school if you don't want to be constantly stuck. By the end of the game, I did have all of the main locations memorised, which took travelling from being a huge chore to just an annoyance. In general, these sections are just the absolute worst. Honestly, there's no reason for it to exist. It doesn't add anything to the game, and instead, it just pads everything out. It's not enjoyable to spend 10 minutes travelling from your dorm to the principal's office, back to your dorm, back to the principal's office, and then finally getting to jump into Lyoko. These sections generally have nothing to do with Lyoko and have more to do with them dealing with basic school life problems. I also found that they went completely overboard with the world they created here. Why the hell is it so large? I'm not joking when I say there are literally dozens of locations here that you will never see unless you go completely off the beaten path. I sort of appreciate the effort, But why go through the bother of making all these random streets and forests and areas of the school that you won't even end up in by accident if you get lost? It's just bizarre. So that's the rundown of the 2D sections, but surely the 3D action portions of the game are a lot better. Nope. In fact, the 3D sections might even be worse. Once you jump into Lyoko, the screens switch around and you start using the top screen to run around. Here you'll take control of Ulrich, Yumi, Odd, and Aelita to battle the evil forces of Xana. You're able to play as all characters in most levels, however, there are some levels where you're required to use specific characters. I did sort of like this, as it meant for the most part you could stick with what you liked, while also forcing you to change it up a little from time to time. Each character plays quite different from one another too. Ulrich uses swords, so he's the melee fighter. Odd uses bombs and a laser gun, so he's the ranged fighter. Yumi is a combination of both, having a melee weapon as well as a ranged attack. Aelita is the final character, but you won't be using her unless absolutely necessary. She's almost purely a defensive character and essentially useless for combat sections. Where Aelita does come into play is deactivating Xana's towers at the end of each level. To do this, you're tasked with solving a jigsaw puzzle. These are nothing more than a minor nuisance to cap off each chapter. On the touchscreen, you can refill health or your special meter and use your character's special abilities. You'll find glowing squares, or data bits as the game calls them, and these will recharge you as well as acting as a currency for the game's upgrade system. This intrigued me initially, however, once you dive in, it's ultimately a disappointment. Not only is fully upgrading your characters incredibly easy, I essentially fully upgraded all 4 characters by the end, but the upgrades are meaningless for the most part. The one upgrade that I found necessary was the health upgrade, which is self-explanatory. The rest were meaningless. You also have an upgrade for your special meter, which I never bought and literally never encountered an issue that made me want to buy it. All of the other upgrades are combos for your characters. These are fighting game-esque combos where you need to memorize specific button inputs to pull them off. Did they really expect players to memorize these different combos for Ulrich, Yumi, and Odd? I only ever remembered one specific one for Odd, and that's because he was my main throughout the entire game. These upgrades are purchased at one of the many checkpoints found throughout levels, and it's also at these checkpoints where you can switch characters. Once you've found the character you like, the only reason to switch characters is if a roadblock necessitates it. As I mentioned earlier, each character has a special ability. Ulrich has a force dash, Yumi uses the force to levitate things, and Aelita uses the force to float. And Odd uses the force to climb. I would have much preferred if you could change characters on the fly. At least then it might have seen some use in changing to specific characters to deal with certain enemies. Instead, the only time you'll use it is when you run into an obstacle, forcing you to backtrack to the last checkpoint, then run all the way back. It's just an annoying system. I've somehow managed to get this far in without actually detailing the combat properly. Each character has 3 basic attacks, as well as a shield that will block and parry incoming projectiles. The Y button is a charged attack, while A and X control light attacks. B is your defend button. While there is a decent amount of choice in the combat system, it's ultimately wasted. Combat is so incredibly basic that all you need to do is mash one single button and you'll be on your way in most cases. Later levels increase the difficulty dramatically, but that doesn't help anything. The game throws a greater amount of enemies at you, but this just makes the combat take longer, rather than making it more nuanced. Instead of forcing you to string combos together, you'll simply be constantly moving and then occasionally taking pot shots, with a parry thrown in every now and then. The fact that most enemies are just massive bullet sponges also hurts things. There's nothing like facing the same enemies you encountered in the first stage at the finale of the game and having them take just as many hits to die. DC Studios also doesn't try to introduce any new wrinkles to the gameplay. This means you're doing the same thing in combat in the first hour as you are in the 6th. Aside from the combat, there's also some light platforming sprinkled throughout. These sections are most prevalent in later levels and they're extremely awkward. This game doesn't even feature a jump button, so you can imagine how janky it all feels here. Awkwardly dropping from platform to platform isn't my idea of a fun game. The only slight variation present here are a few vehicle sections. These are dreadfully easy, but I guess it's better than nothing. My last point on the 3D sections is that I found Lyoko to be quite ugly. Maybe I'm being harsh and maybe I'm expecting too much of the Nintendo DS, but something about most of these environments just seems off. I feel like they could have done a lot better considering most levels are just platforms floating in an endless void. These levels are in stark contrast to the 2D sections, which actually feature really nice art throughout.
Join the battle against Santa, Code Lyoko style. Get ready to virtualize. The fate of the worlds of Earth and Lyoko are in great danger. One thing is certain, our heroes are ready to risk everything to win the fight. Play as your favorite characters, Yumi, Odd, Alita, Ulrich, and Jeremy. Code Lyoko for the Nintendo DS is packed with hordes of monsters, intense minigames, and blazing fast driving sections.
I'm sure it's no surprise to you to hear that I did not enjoy my time with Code Lyoko Get Ready to Virtualize. This game isn't even remotely fun, and it was such a slog to get through that it's made me dread the other Code Lyoko games coming up. In my opinion, I think they should have removed the 2D sections completely. I get that they were trying to stay true to the show, but this was never going to work out well. The dull trekking around the school is so tedious and mostly just pads the game's length out. It took me roughly 6 hours to beat the game, but I utilised the refill health cheat to power me through to the finish. Without that, it would have taken much longer. If you were to remove the 2D sections and replace them purely with cutscenes, I guarantee it would have made the game much easier to stomach. I also want to know how in the hell they're going to string out 2 more Code Lyoko games. There are 4 seasons of the show, and this game takes you all the way to the premiere of Season 3. From some quick research, I see that Quest for Infinity is essentially a straight up sequel, keeping the same sort of gameplay. However, I've read that it jumps straight to covering Season 4. The final game, Fall of Xana, also seems to cover Season 4 as well, but uses turn-based gameplay instead. Surely there's not enough content to stop these 2 games from covering the exact same ground. Overall, Code Lyoko Get Ready to Virtualize is a bad game. The 2D sections are bland and annoying, while the 3D sections are devoid of any interesting gameplay. I was going to give them credit for having the show's soundtrack present, but at this point in time, it's no longer impressive. It should be expected that they'll rip the songs straight from the show by now. The only slight positive is that they included scenes from the show. When that's your only positive, you know you've made a poor game. I'm starting to miss the days when Cartoon Network games were absolute dumpster fires when they were bad. We've come to a point in time where all of the games are competently made in a technical sense, but for the most part, they're just awful to play. I'd kill for a glitchy mess like Disaster Strikes, or a game that finishes in 30 minutes like Chemical Extraction. Next week we're heading back to consoles as we check out Ben 10 Protector of Earth. That will mark the point when Cartoon Network milks the hell out of Ben 10, and it's the first of 8 Ben 10 games that were released across a 6-year span. Let's hope Cartoon Network games can return to form with that one.